I'd say the general trend is that snow is decreasing, and certainly in the coming decades, we're going to see more and more of that as temperatures continue to warm. It's just going to be less likely that precipitation is falling as snow in a lot of places. And I think I know in Europe, a few resorts have closed just in the last year due to lack of snow, and not just not open for a season, but just ceased operations. So I think we're really seeing that snow totals are impacting the ski industry.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. In episode 159 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are heading into ski and snowboard season. Now, we don't have very many episodes focused around the snow sports industry. There's a few, shout out to Ted Ligety in his episode, but as we gear up for winter sports, I wanted to sit down and look at how we are enjoying our winter season with a little more critical of a lens. We've all experienced a rapid change in weather patterns throughout the last 10 or more years, and skiing is at the forefront of these climate change impacts. Warmer winters, shrinking snowpacks, and unpredictable conditions are transforming the sport as we know it. So to help us unpack this pressing issue, we're joined by Anneka Williams. Originally from Vermont's Mad River Valley, Anneka is a climate scientist, and she holds a bachelor's degree in biology and earth and oceanic science, and a master's degree in climate change from the University of Copenhagen. Anneka has worked on climate and environmental issues on 4 different continents and pursued stories and ski lines around the world. Currently, Anneka is based in Salt Lake City, Utah, where she works on climate resilience in the energy sector and as a freelance writer. All right, so thank you so much for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today. To get us rolling, I would love to know how you became interested in outdoor recreation, and then how that passion began to influence your decision to pursue a career in climate science.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So I grew up in rural Vermont, and spending time in the woods and by the river and exploring outside was just pretty common in my community. So I think thanks to that upbringing, I just sort of fell in love with being outside. And my family had a farm as well. And raising animals definitely forces you to be very in tune with the seasons and invested in understanding ecological systems. So I think that also played a role in kind of helping spark an interest in just the natural world and being outside. And then when I got to college, it was frankly really hard for me to choose what I wanted to focus on academically, because I really liked spending time outside and I enjoyed a lot of different disciplines like arts and sciences. So I kind of tried a lot of different things, and then serendipitously, I had the opportunity to do climate science research in subarctic Alaska one summer, and that kind of really put me on the path that I've been on since then. Through that experience, we were connecting with Alaska Native communities on the front lines of climate change. We were at an expedition field camp in the tundra. It was kind of just the perfect mix for me of outdoor adventure, science, meaningful work, connecting with people. There was art and writing involved with our project. So that kind of showed me that climate science was incredibly interdisciplinary, and that's why I do that now.
That's amazing. That sounds like an awesome experience. And so I'm trying to think of where my brain is not functioning that well the last 2 days for obvious reasons.
No worries.
Okay, so as a climate scientist, what type of work are you regularly doing, or how does that fit into your life currently?
Yeah, so currently I work for an organization called ICF doing climate resilience work. And basically what that means is my team is downscaling global climate models to very hyper local and regional scales for clients that we're working with. And then using projections of future climate change to work with our clients to build resilience and sort of say if you have a better understanding of what climate change could look for your specific region, you can then prepare yourself better. And that involves a lot of upfront work in terms of deciding like, how are you going to mitigate an increasing risk of wildfires if that's something you're dealing with. And that can take a lot of like financial resources. So I think knowing early is really important for building resilience to make those investments up front, as well as just like knowing what you're facing. So that's like a lot of my day to day. And then I'm also a freelance writer, and I work mostly in the outdoor space. And a lot of what I cover these days relates to the intersection of climate change and environmental issues with skiing and other outdoor sports.
Yeah, and that's what made you an absolutely perfect guest, absolute dream guest to be a climate scientist. And today we're going to be talking a lot about how climate change is impacting our ski season or snowboard season, however you enjoy the snow season, I guess. And before we get into deeper implications and snow totals and all those good things, I am curious how you have witnessed in your normal life as a skier the changes that have been happening in the last decade or so due to climate change, and if you have any specific examples where it would be more obvious.
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned earlier, I grew up skiing in Vermont, and what I've noticed the most there is that the ski season is just shorter. Like recently, it's felt like the winter starts a little later than it used to. And I did some digging, and there have been studies of snow cover in the Northeast. And so the region is seeing 2 to 3 fewer weeks of snow cover compared to 100 years ago. But the majority of that has happened in the last several decades. Additionally, I'd say like a greater proportion of winter precipitation is falling as rain. Like I feel like a lot of times when I've been home visiting family recently, around the holiday season, it's been rainy, whereas when I was younger, it was snowy. So that's been something I've noticed. And then just like drastic temperature fluctuations. Like there might be, like frost and snow, and then suddenly there's like a really unseasonably warm day in the middle of February, and then it's like back into winter. So just a little more like volatile conditions. So that's what I've noticed in Vermont. And I think that's the place that I've still spent the most of my life. And climate change is like changes in trends over time. It's not changes in weather day to day. So I think Vermont is still the best frame of reference I have for noticing changing winter. That being said, I'm currently based in Salt Lake City, Utah. And one of the impacts of climate change that we're seeing here is dust on snow in the Wasatch. So the Great Salt Lake is shrinking due to a decades-long mega drought and rising temperatures. And that's the climate issue. That's what climate change is accelerating. And one of the consequences of that is that there's more dust exposed as the lake dries, and that is blowing into the mountains. And so there are days where it's really visible on the snow that you're skiing on. And the implications of that for snow is that it accelerates melt. And this can impact watersheds and water resources, which especially out west are, tenuous and scarce. So yeah, I'd say like dust on snow is kind of another interesting climate impact I notice in my current geography.
Wow, yeah, the dust on snow is so interesting. It is not one that I really have considered before, but it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, you mentioned the shorter winters in Vermont, seeing rain, but are there other pretty significant ways that climate change is impacting like snow totals and then ski conditions in other regions?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say like zooming out, like the scientist in me wants to kind of like break this down and say that like the two basic conditions we need to produce snow are cold temperatures and moisture in the atmosphere, right? Like it's a pretty like simple equation. And climate change is impacting both of these conditions, but kind of in interesting ways where like temperatures are getting warmer. And so that, if we have less freezing temperatures, that might limit snow, but warmer air can actually hold more moisture. So the atmosphere has more moisture in it. And that's why we're seeing more rain in certain places, but we're also actually seeing more snow in certain places right now. And that's because it's sort of like the moisture in the atmosphere is increasing and the temperature hasn't yet gotten too hot for that to fall as rain in certain regions at certain times of year. So there are actually places that are experiencing more snow. But I'd say the general trend is that snow is decreasing. And certainly in the coming decades, we're going to see more and more of that as temperatures continue to warm. It's just going to be less likely that precipitation is falling as snow in a lot of places. And I think like, I know in Europe, like a few resorts have closed just in the last year due to lack of snow, and like not just like not open for a season, but just like ceased operations. So I think we're like really seeing that snow totals are impacting the ski industry. And like a lot of resorts are kind of grappling with what that means for them. But I'd say we're also going to continue to see like more snow in some places and just more volatile and unpredictable snowfall. Like I think the weather is more unsettled. And that could bring some like pretty insane winters to certain places where skiers are stoked. But I'd say that doesn't necessarily mean we don't have, and it definitely doesn't mean that we don't have an issue. And I found a 2023 survey actually of more than 2,000 locations across the US, and 64% of the locations surveyed were getting less snowfall than they did in the early 1970s. So I'd say that's like the general trend.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, people who are going out every year and skiing are likely already noticing and recognizing a lot of these changes, likely because it's impacting a sport that they really enjoy and look forward to throughout the year. And I think the industry, like you mentioned, the resort response is also struggling. They're trying to figure out, do we make more snow? Do we shorten the season? How can we handle this? And so from your perspective, do you think the ski industry is responding to these changes like in a productive way?
That's such a good question. I think there are a lot of different actors in the ski industry. Like there are so many different resorts. There are brands that provide the gear that we use when we go skiing or snowboarding or recreate on snow. And then there are like individual skiers who are just like planning trips, getting out there, whatever that looks like for you. And I would say across all of those different actors, we're seeing people responding. I think the efficacy of response really varies. But I think like a lot of resorts are adapting to less snow. Like I think we're seeing more snowmaking. We're seeing resorts that are just like ceasing operations. I feel like a lot of resorts are diversifying, where they're sort of saying like, okay, like winter might be shorter, like we just can't operate as much, but like we're going to build awesome mountain bike trails and expand that network, because that's a 3-season activity that can like generate income. So, resorts or businesses, lack of snow threatens that business, they're finding other options to bring people to visit them. And likewise, I'd say like there are brands out there that are kind of like recognizing the role that they might play in perpetuating climate change and pushing back on the idea of stuff in the way that we think about it. Season Equipment, I think, is a really good example of a ski company that's like really trying to extend the life of its products and push back on the idea that you need to buy new gear every year. Like they're sort of like, no, we're going to make a good pair of skis that you can have for a long time, and just like generally limit what we're producing. Like Patagonia's Wornwear model is a great example of a more circular approach to business. So I think like people are responding, and I think different responses address different things. I usually like to think of like the two buckets as adaptation and mitigation, where adaptation is like adjusting to the current and future impacts of climate change. So that would involve like making more snow and just kind of being like, we have less snow, we're going to make more. And then mitigation would really more be like, how do we like limit our impact and curb emissions? And I think that generally seems to be like more of an emerging area and an opportunity area for the industry.
Yeah, I love the examples that you gave for some of like the industry responses. But do you think that, or what do you think ski brands in particular have as a responsibility in addressing these climate change conversations and sustainability in general? And do you have any like thoughts from the scientist side as to like how they can contribute more to climate action?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say like I absolutely think that the ski industry has responsibility for climate change, but what's challenging is that like many resorts and brands are private entities. So there's no like responsibility forced on them. Like it's more on the voluntary side of things. But given that snow is such a threatened resource, I think brands and resorts are increasingly stepping up and saying like, we have to engage with this issue in some way. I think from the science side of things, like responsibility for in addressing the climate crisis or the issue of climate change needs to encompass adaptation and mitigation. Like the climate is changing now. Like we have evidence that snow totals have changed due to human caused climate change. So adaptation is like, essential. Like brands, resorts, individual skiers, like we are going to need to change what we do if we haven't already. And I think a lot of people have, whether they recognize that or not. Like, you plan ski trips to places that have snow, and that might look different than where you were planning ski trips 20 years ago. But I think mitigation is also really important too. And no brand or resort or individual is going to be impact free, and that's okay. Like it's not about perfection, and it's not about bringing your impact to zero or sitting inside and like, being like, I'm just going to have like the least impact possible. But I think we really need more transparency about the impact that resorts and brands do have in order to find the opportunities to reduce this impact and implement meaningful climate solutions. So I think like, kind of just like analyses of like where resorts' biggest impacts are coming from is a really important first step to then be able to come in and say like, okay, like let's look at these results and think about where the opportunities to like leverage change are. And then I think brands and resorts need to be authentic in the choices they're making. So like moving beyond greenwashing, moving beyond like putting recycling bins at the base area and sort of saying like, no, like we need to like step up and like be change makers. And that likely will involve like challenging and risky decisions for businesses. But like those are the decisions that need to be made. And then, ski resorts generally are like pretty big players in the communities in which they're a part. And I think like putting political pressure on the right people and getting people in office who are going to advance climate policy is really important, as is like engaging with local and national environmental partners and promoting forest conservation rather than development in like resort periphera, and educating guests and consumers about like the issues that brands are facing and the issues that resorts are facing and the solutions they're trying to implement. So I think, that was a lot of information, and all that is to say like there is responsibility, and depending on how you show up in the ski industry, that responsibility is going to look different, but we all have a role to play.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up those aspects, and resorts should just hire you to analyze these things, right? No, but I recently wrote an article for Elevation Outdoors about the impact of ski resorts. It's in the most recent issue, I think. I'll link it. But it was hard to find information about like their actual impact, where they had like these sustainability pages and everything, but there weren't a lot of explicit impact reports like you see from like a product company, that like someone that's producing goods. But there is an obvious like environmental impact that these entities are having. So it would be nice to see like more detailed analyses from that perspective. And also, I should have asked you this earlier, but I know a lot of people in the outdoor industry are very concerned with the results of the 2024 election and entering into a new Trump administration, Trump era for the next 4 years, and what that means for the climate, because it will likely have some devastating effects. And I mean, if we're already seeing a drastic loss of snow, increased wildfires, more dramatic natural disasters in general, do you think, I guess I don't know what my question is. I'm just like a little reeling in the reality that a climate denier is going to be in office, and that pretty much the entire government is seated with climate deniers.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we're like 2 days past the election. So I'm also definitely still reeling and like wrapping my head around what another Trump presidency looks like. I mean, what I know is that it doesn't bode well for climate policy, and, you know, climate policy that's in place, as well as climate policy that was sort of in the works. I mean, I think as a result of the impending shift in administration, so like, you know, moving to a new Trump presidency, I think climate action is largely going to shift to the state and local level. Like it's going to need to be. Like, I don't think we're going to be able to count on the federal government to continue pushing things forward. And I think we'll see some things repealed. So I think we're going to need like informed and active citizens more than ever. And I think we're going to need entities like resorts and brands and like people in the private sector who can kind of just like do what they want, to step up and take more responsibility. So I would definitely encourage people everywhere, and certainly people in the ski industry, to stay engaged in advocating for the changes we need to address climate change. And just think about the fact that like maybe we're not doing that at a federal level for the next 4 years, and maybe advocating at that level doesn't feel super meaningful. And I totally hear that. But like, you know, write to your local resort managers, like get involved in state and local politics. Like, I think there's going to be a huge movement to have a lot of climate action passed at that level to kind of like keep things progressing forward, even as federal policies might be repealed or at least blocked for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it back to like a local, state, and private sector focus, because I think that's where we have at least some power and control, right? And so we can really like lean into those aspects moving forward. And so if we look a little bit more narrowly, and eventually get to kind of personal choices, let's talk a little bit about athletes and influencers in this space. And are there ways that people that maybe have a larger platform can leverage these things for climate advocacy?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love this question. This is something I think about a lot. Like, I am a very like average skier. But there are lots of like big athletes and social media influencers, in Utah, and like certainly people that I interact with. And one thing that I always return to when thinking about the question of like how much power do these people really have is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releases reports pretty periodically with kind of like updates on the state of the climate. And these are massive documents. Like, you know, it's not like light reading by any means, but it's certainly something that I have to be really familiar with in my job. And one of the takeaways from the most recent report, assessment report 6, from the IPCC, they state explicitly social influencers and thought leaders can increase the adoption of low carbon technologies, behaviors, and lifestyles. That's a statement that they're not just making up. That's grounded in very, very rigorous evidence, and input from subject matter experts. And that's pretty cool. Like, this is an international, very well-regarded climate report that's acknowledging the power that people with some level of social influence can have. So I think people like social media influencers, athletes, like people that have a large social capital and following, like really need to recognize the power that they have in those positions and harness it for good. And I don't at all think that means that those people have to be perfect. But I do think it's important for them to recognize that they actually do play an outsized role in shaping norms in the communities of which they're a part. So like ski athletes who have a huge following, like they do like impact like what people think of in the ski community and like norms and behaviors that people adopt. And so I think it's important for those people to like, you know, be well educated and well informed, and like really practice what they preach when it comes to climate action. And I think Utah actually had a really cool example. Recently, Carolyn Gleich, a professional ski mountaineer, ran for U.S. Senate seat as a Democrat in Utah, which is, you know, no small feat in a deep red state. And I think she lost, but she really like pushed the narrative forward and like challenged Utah politicians in a very real way. And I think seeing her do that for me, like really upped the ante on individual action, where it's like she was able to translate the like following that she's built as an athlete into the realm of politics. And that was really, really incredible. And that was not without personal sacrifice on her end, and not without like incredible discomfort on her end. So I would say social media influencers and athletes have a really big role to play.
Yeah, I was so sad to see that she lost, but her campaign, I feel like, was really inspiring. And hopefully we can see more enthusiasm around candidates like that in the future. And I mean, if we do look at individual action, then even if you don't have hundreds of millions, or not hundreds of millions, but hundreds of thousands of followers on social media or anything like that, everyone does have an impact in their community, with their friends, with their families. And so how can skiers, individuals, anyone kind of balance those things and hopefully harness their impact?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a really important question in the climate space. Like, I think we often set up the narrative that it's either system change or individual action. And I really don't think it has to be in competition. I think it's a both and approach. And I would say, like, objectively, there are big players with a lot of influence, like think big politicians, big oil, corporations, governments. And these are where some of the biggest levers for change are. And so, like, certainly those are areas we should be focusing on for harnessing change. But individual actions taken from the seats we're in can help drive consumer preferences. They can contribute to the creation of collective voice. We can keep people engaged and accountable in this issue just by talking about it in the communities we're a part of. So I think individual actions really can add up and create a groundswell. And I think that often is how change happens. So, thinking about people in the ski community and individual skiers, like, I would say, like, stay informed, like, know what's happening, like, pay attention to snow total trends over time, like, take some time as we head into the season to look up, like, how much snow is your local resort getting in the early 1900s and the mid 1900s, and how much is it getting now? And, like, what are you learning? What are you seeing? So just, like, stay engaged with the issue and stay informed on the issue. And then figure out what contributing for you looks like what's going to feel meaningful and purposeful for you from the position that you're in. And that could be writing to state representatives, that could be getting involved in local sustainability efforts in your, like, municipality or county or at your resort. That could be, like, pushing for change at your resort. Like, if you don't feel like there's a good public transport option, like, maybe other people are, like, rallying around that and you can get behind that. And then I think, like, you can advocate with your dollars by supporting brands that are investing in the climate and are, like, taking the business risk to, like, offer sustainable materials, or, participate in consignment stores or opportunities to get gear secondhand, because that's a really good way to, like, signal that you care about reducing stuff and reducing impact while still doing what you love. Because I'd say, like, at the same time as all of this, like, keep skiing. Like, being passionate about things fuels your commitment to doing the work to stay engaged with the issue and pushing for change. And I think for the environmental movement to have any hope of being sustainable, it cannot be doom and gloom. And it cannot be like, we're going to, like, suffer and cut off everything to, like, bring our impact to zero. Like, we have to find things that keep us fired up to keep working for change. And it's really important to stay connected to what and who you love, even as we navigate, like, a lot of uncertainty and, like, fear around what the future of our environments look like. So I would say, like, stay engaged, stay informed, and keep skiing, like, keep getting out there and keep, like, reminding yourself why you're fighting this fight.
Those are amazing calls to action. Is there anything else that you would like to add or share that you feel like maybe we missed or you want to include?
Yeah. I'd say the only thing I'd add is that there's uncertainty about what the future of climate change looks like. And I actually find that, as a scientist, really comforting. Like, every single day, like, my job involves making decisions about using different future emission scenarios to model what the future will look like. So inherent in that is the understanding that we still have the power to change the course. Like, emissions next year have an impact on the future. Emissions in 2030 have an impact on the future. So yes, things are already changing. And yes, there's like a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we've already contributed to the atmosphere. But the extent of damage is still a choice that we have. So giving up now is like not an option, and it's not helpful. And I think kind of remembering that like we still have a lot of power to change the future, like scientifically speaking, emotionally speaking, philosophically speaking, like I really deeply believe that's true. And so as we continue to address climate change, I would just encourage all of us to be really curious. Like I think implementing effective solutions is going to require innovative and creative thinking. And we're going to need to be open to a lot of different possibilities about what that looks like. So just like remembering that we still have agency and choice here, and then just being open to like the future looking really different is super important, and something that I remind myself of every day.
Yes, that was inspiring, uplifting. Yeah, I've been in a doom and gloom mindset for the last few days, so that was definitely good to hear. But with that, Anneka, do you have other resources you would like to share, or how can listeners learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, I have a website, annekawilliams.com, and my email's on there, but for anyone listening, it's also annekawilliams24@gmail.com. I love connecting with people. I'm always happy to answer questions. I think, frankly, there are so many resources out there that if you're looking for something in particular, like feel free to reach out and I can help you track down the right thing. I'd say Climate Central is one of my favorite resources for finding evidence of attribution, which is basically like looking in the past, like how can we attribute events to climate change, or like, you know, snow totals, like how can we see snow totals declining? So that's a great resource. But yeah, always happy to connect and share information.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing all that information, and I'll be sure to share all of those resources in the show notes below. But with that, thank you so much for your time and sharing all those amazing insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.